Welcome to the mini book podcast, Proof of Christ edition. We are discussing the book, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth by Bart D. Ehrman.
We thank you for listening, and we sincerely hope you will consider subscribing for future content.
Absolutely. And after hearing this, we would really encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author.
That's right. Now, these voices you're hearing, they do come from AI, but the content is drawn straight from the book.
And we feel that this is just a great way to learn about the historical evidence for why Jesus Christ existed.
And our focus today is purely historical. We're going to be examining the evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, and we're relying on the really rigorous analysis that Bart Ehrman provides in the book.
Right, and he's a critically acclaimed scholar of the New Testament and early Christianity. He's also known for his agnostic, sometimes even atheist-leaning views.
And that's really important for you to know up front. His goal here isn't to promote a religious agenda at all. It's to use established historical methods to answer a single question. Did a man named Jesus of Nazareth actually exist?
And what he finds, and this really forms the foundation of our entire discussion today, is that there is an overwhelming consensus among trained scholars in these fields. We're talking experts in the New Testament, early Christianity, classics, antiquity, and the consensus is that Jesus existed. This isn't really a theological argument, it's a historical reality that's accepted by, virtually every expert on the planet.
Exactly. So our mission is to guide you through the literature of the mythicists, those who argue that Jesus is a myth, a story with no historical basis, and show why mainstream scholarship just doesn't accept their claims.
So we'll systematically review the evidence, the independent evidence that confirms Jesus's existence.
And then we'll apply the same historical tools we'd use for studying Caesar or Cleopatra to try and establish the context of who the historical Jesus actually was.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack this term, mythicist. When someone claims Jesus is a myth, what exactly are they saying?
Well, in a scholarly context, the word myth can mean something like a foundational story that conveys deep meaning. But that's not how these authors, the mythicists, are using it.
Right.
For them, it means a story with absolutely no historical basis, a history-like narrative that, in fact, just didn't happen. In their view, Jesus' life, his death, his teachings, all of it was entirely fabricated.
So no man named Jesus actually walked the earth doing these things.
That's their position.
And it's so critical to stress that this view, while you might see it in certain corners of the internet or maybe in places that were politically anti-religious, like the former Soviet Union.
Or parts of Scandinavia, yeah.
It's just utterly unsupported by scholars. Scholars trained in accredited theological seminaries, divinity schools, major universities around the world.
That really is the key structural flaw. Ehrman points out that the danger for the general public, for you, is that knowledge about early Christianity often comes from these really sensationalist pop culture sources.
Like the Da Vinci Code or something.
Exactly, or even satirical movies, instead of from trained historians. And these historians are the ones who mastered the ancient languages. We're talking Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic.
A whole suite of them.
And they've spent entire careers just immersed in the historical context of the ancient Mediterranean world. Without that deep background, a lot of these historical claims just fall apart.
So we have to look at the history of this skepticism. Who are the early academic skeptics, and who are the modern, more sensationalist claimants that Ehrman really takes on?
Well, the challenge in academia started mainly with a 19th century German theologian, Bruno Bauer. Bauer was certainly brilliant, but he was highly idiosyncratic.
What does that mean exactly, idiosyncratic?
It just means he held very peculiar, very individualistic views that sort of defied the academic norms of his time. He argued that Jesus was a purely literary invention.
A
character created by the gospel writers, who, he claimed, basically amalgamated Jewish prophecy with Roman Stoic philosophy. But the key historical takeaway is that, despite his intellectual stature, Bauer had virtually no scholarly followers. His ideas were academic footnotes, not a mainstream challenge.
That sounds like a sophisticated, if, unconvincing academic theory. But the modern version, the one that sells books today, is much more sensational. Let's talk about the claims of Acaria S. D.M. Murdoch in The Christ Conspiracy.
Murdoch's claims are a perfect example of this sensationalism replacing scholarship. Her core argument is that Jesus was just a sun god. She insists on this phonetic link. The Son of God is just a confusion for the Son of God.
All right.
And the whole Christian narrative is an astrotheological myth. a story based on the movement of the sun and stars invented in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE.
And this is where it gets interesting, because Ehrman, reading her work, points out what he calls numerous howlers. And these aren't just minor disagreements.
No, not at all. They are blatant factual errors that really destroy the credibility of the entire thesis.
So what are some of these howlers?
Well, they're so basic that, a first-year graduate student in ancient history would spot them. For instance, Murdoch claims there are no New Testament manuscripts that survive from before the 4th century CE.
And that's just not true.
It's demonstrably false. We have fragments, the P52 fragment of John, for example, that date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Her timeline is just wrong. She also claims the faith began in Alexandria in the 2nd century, but we have evidence from Paul, from others, of followers in Palestine in the 30s of the 1st century. Decades earlier.
What about some of the more fantastical, made-up claims she uses to add a little spice to the story?
The most famous one Ehrman brings up is her fabricated detail about a supposed penis-nosed statue of Peter the Cock hidden away in the Vatican.
Which doesn't exist.
It just does not exist. It's an invention used to shock or sensationalize. And when an author is willing to invent non-existent ancient artifacts or make claims about manuscript dating that are so easily refuted, their work stops being history. It becomes entertainment, and highly inaccurate entertainment at that.
Okay, so another major claim comes from Freak and Gandhi in their book, The Jesus Mysteries, and they assert that Christianity was just a Jewish adaptation of pagan mystery religions.
Right, and this is a very widely circulated idea. They argue that ancient figures like Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, Attis, they were all variations of a single, universal God-man myth, a divine figure who dies and rises again.
And they claim these pagan figures share specific details with Jesus' story.
Very specific details. They claim they were born on December 25th, born in a cave, turned water to wine, were crucified, and resurrected on the 3rd day.
But the scholarly critique here is pretty brutal, right? They fail to cite any ancient sources for these parallels.
Precisely. And that is the absolute heart of the critique. They rely entirely on assertions and summaries made by other 19th and 20th century writers who also fail to provide ancient citations.
So it's just repeating a claim without checking the original source.
Exactly. Let's just take a few of those points. No ancient source says Osiris was born on December 25th, or that he was crucified, or that his death brought atonement for sin. Mithras has no resurrection story at all in any ancient evidence we have.
The crucifixion detail seems particularly problematic.
It is, because crucifixion was a specifically Roman method of execution. So this God-man myth is used as a template, but when you actually look for the documentation to support the specific details, it just doesn't exist in the ancient world.
So if we look past the sensationalism and try to boil down the more thoughtful, though flawed, core mythicist arguments, what are the key points they raise against historicity?
They essentially try to dismantle the historical evidence chain in 4 ways. First, they argue that no non-Christian sources mention Jesus until decades after he supposedly lived. They say this 1st century silence means he didn't exist.
Okay.
Second, they argue that the few non-Christian references we do have, especially the 2 passages in the historian Josephus, are just later Christian interpolations. Insertions designed to shore up the historical claim.
What's the third point?
Third, they point out that early Christian writings outside the Gospels, especially Paul's letters, say almost nothing about the historical Jesus, his deeds, his teachings, his earthly life.
And the final point circles back to the God-man idea.
It does. They circle back to the claim that Jesus is just a fabricated figure based on these earlier dying, rising God myths, which, as we just showed, lacks any real documentation.
That sets up our investigation perfectly. We need to assess these 4 claims, starting with those non-Christian sources that the mythicists are so quick to dismiss.
And we have to begin with a point of agreement with them. It is entirely true that no Greek or Roman author from the 1st century mentions Jesus.
And for the listener, that often sounds like damning evidence. If he was so important, why did nobody write about him in his own lifetime? Let's unpack the contextual credibility of this silence. Why is this lack of mention neither surprising nor relevant to historians?
It's all about social standing and historical scope. Jesus was a lower-class Jewish teacher operating in what was basically a Roman backwater province. To expect him to show up in the surviving records of elite Roman historians is to just fundamentally misunderstand who the Romans documented.
It's a myth that they kept detailed records of everyone.
A complete myth. They focused on rulers, armies, major political crises.
Can we anchor that with an analogy? I mean, if Jesus was so low status, how did more influential figures fare in the historical record?
That's a great question. Take the Roman figures. Pontius Pilate, the governor who condemned Jesus, is mentioned only in passing by the historian Tacitus, writing decades later. He was barely worth a note. Now take the Jewish figures, Josephus, the incredibly prominent aristocratic Jewish historian, a first-century celebrity who wrote these huge works about the Jewish war and their history.
You would expect him to be mentioned.
You would. And he is mentioned never in contemporary Greek or Roman sources of his own day. So if the key Jewish historian and the Roman governor are basically footnotes or just absent, the chances that an itinerant peasant preacher would be mentioned are virtually zero. The silence of the first century isn't evidence of non-existence. It's evidence of his social insignificance to the Roman elite.
By the 2nd century, though, that changes. The Christian movement has spread, and now it's a political problem for the empire. The earliest reference we have is Pliny the Younger, around 112 CE.
Yes, Pliny was the Roman governor of Bithynia Pontus, which is modern-day Turkey. He wrote to the Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to handle Christians. The Romans were always paranoid about illegal gatherings.
Right, they feared political uprisings.
Exactly. They feared sedition, armed revolt. I mean, even something as harmless as a local fire brigade could be banned. And Christianity was seen as this dangerous secret society.
And in this political letter, Pliny actually describes the Christians' beliefs and practices, which he must have gotten from interrogating them.
Correct. Pliny reports that Christians came from various socioeconomic levels. They gathered early in the morning. And crucially, that they sing hymns to Christ as to a god.
So what's the historical value there?
The value is that it confirms the rapid spread of the movement and its central belief, the worship of Christ as divine, in a distant province by the early 2nd century. However, as you said, Pliny's source is the Christians themselves. So it's not independent confirmation of Jesus' existence, but it confirms the existence of a movement that was absolutely rooted in a historical figure.
Now, the more compelling piece of evidence, the one that mythicists have to directly confront, is from the Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 115 CE, so about 85 years after the crucifixion.
Right. Tacitus, one of Rome's greatest historians, was writing his annals about the Emperor Nero's reign and the Great Fire of Rome back in 64 CE. He reports that Nero deflected blame for the fire onto the Christians, and he says this: "The author of this name, Christ, was put to death by the procurator, Pontius Pilate, while Tiberius was emperor."
That single passage, even though it's, hearsay written 85 years later, provides independent confirmation of 4 essential historical facts that fit the narrative we have from Christian sources.
Absolutely. It confirms the name Christ, his execution by a Roman official, Pontius Pilate, the timing during the reign of Tiberius, and the origin of the movement in Judea. Tacitus, an elite Roman, was clearly aware of the official Roman understanding of where this group he despised came from.
Mythicists often counter that this must be an interpolation, a later Christian scribe just inserting text into Tacitus to legitimize their founder. Why do scholars of antiquity dismiss that claim so quickly?
For a couple of key reasons. First, the tone is overtly hostile. Tacitus calls Christianity a dangerous superstition. He uses derogatory language. A Christian scribe inserting text would almost certainly have used favorable language, not insulting language, to refer to their founder.
That makes sense.
Second, there's a minor historical inaccuracy. Tacitus calls Pilate the procurator, when historical and archaeological evidence suggests Pilate's title was more likely prefect. A later Christian scribe, faking the passage, would have likely used the correct title. The fact that Tacitus uses a term that's slightly off for Pilate's time, but correct for his own time, actually confirms it's an authentic part of his record.
Okay, now let's turn to the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century. He provides the 2 most significant, though challenging, non-Christian references. Let's start with the one that's rarely disputed.
Josephus, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, discusses the execution of a man named James, who was the leader of the Jerusalem church. And in that context, Josephus refers to him as James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ.
And that brief reference is crucial because it just fits so naturally into Josephus's narrative about internal Jewish politics.
It does. And as we'll discuss later, this reference to Jesus' biological brother is a major stumbling block for the mythicist position. Even if Jesus were a total fabrication, the existence of his brother James, who achieved historical prominence, demands an explanation.
It connects the movement to a real, known family.
Exactly. The second passage, however, is the more famous and controversial one, the Testimonium Flavianum. That just means testimony of Flavius Josephus.
And the version we have today is pretty overtly Christian.
It is. The passage we have in the manuscript says things like Jesus was the Messiah, that he appeared on the third day, and that he was more than a man.
Now, Josephus was a practicing Jew who never converted. There is zero chance he would have written those claims himself. So what's the accepted scholarly consensus?
The consensus is that the core of the passage is authentic, but it was touched up or edited by later Christian scribes, probably around the 4th century, by people like the historian Eusebius, who were really eager to co-opt Josephus as a witness for their faith.
So if we apply historical analysis to remove the overt Christian theology, what did Josephus most likely write? What is the pared-down original version?
Most scholars, including people like John P. Meyer or Ehrman himself, they agree that Josephus originally wrote something like this. Jesus was a wise man, a doer of startling deeds, and a teacher who gained many followers, both Jews and Greeks. He was accused by our principal men, the Jewish leaders, and condemned to the cross by Pilate. And the followers who loved him did not cease to exist, and the tribe of Christians, as he called them, did not die out.
That pared-down version still confirms his existence, his reputation, his execution, and the continuation of his movement. But why does Ehrman argue that even if the testimonium were a complete fabrication, it's only marginally relevant to the historical case?
Because Josephus, writing this in the 90s CE, was not an eyewitness. He was writing 60 years after the events. So if he wrote that pared-down version, he was probably just reporting what was common knowledge in his day, that a man named Jesus was executed under Pilate, and his followers continued on. The real historical weight has to lie in sources that are much closer to Jesus' lifetime, sources that rely on independent traditions.
Right, so when we turn to the Christian sources, particularly the Gospels, we have to start by acknowledging their nature. I mean, they're documents of faith, written by believers, with an agenda. Can we as historians even trust them?
We have to treat them as historical sources, absolutely, albeit ones with a strong bias, just like we would treat Caesar's account of his own Gallic campaigns. You don't just dismiss a source because it became sacred. To do that is neither fair nor scholarly.
And Luke even admits it.
He does. The author of Luke explicitly states he was relying on earlier written narratives and accounts from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. That confirms these aren't instantaneous divine records. They're compilations of earlier material.
And this leads us directly to the concept of multiple attestation. The idea that having numerous independent sources for Jesus' life is the strongest internal argument against him being an invention. Let's start with the relationship between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
The synoptics are named that because they can be seen together, due to their high degree of similarity in structure and content. Mark is generally accepted as the earliest, written around 70 CE. And scholars have firmly established that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as their primary source.
But critically, they also used other, now lost, written sources.
Exactly. And this is where we get the letter codes that historians use to map these sources. Mark is one source. But Matthew and Luke share a large amount of material that isn't found in Mark. So how do historians explain this?
This is Q, right?
This is Q. Q stands for Quell, the German word for source. They hypothesized the existence of a second, entirely written source, Q, which consisted mainly of Jesus' sayings. Its existence is the most logical way to explain why Matthew and Luke often quote the exact same words or short parables, but always in different contexts within their own Gospels.
Can you give us a concrete example of something from Q?
Sure. A perfect example would be the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer. Both Matthew and Luke have versions of these, but they're dramatically different. Matthew's Beatitudes are very spiritual, blessed are the poor in spirit,
Right.
while Luke's are social, blessed are you who are poor. Yet the fact that they both contain a list of Beatitudes and the core prayer structure suggests they were drawing from a common written source of sayings. That's Q.
So we have Mark, we have Q, we have M for Matthew's unique material, like the Magi story.
And L for Luke's unique material, like the story of the Good Samaritan.
The takeaway here is that the idea that Jesus was just invented can't possibly explain the existence of, 7 or more independent sources? Mark, Q, M, L, John's sources, early Passion narratives, the kernel of the Gospel of Thomas, all circulating across the Roman Empire within decades of this man's supposed lifetime.
It creates an almost insurmountable historical probability. If you invent a figure, you generally have one single narrative, which then gets copied. But here, we have multiple streams of independent traditions, all pointing back to one central figure who was active in Palestine.
And we can push these traditions back even further using linguistic evidence, specifically the fact that Jesus spoke Aramaic, not the Greek of the Gospels.
This is a powerful historical footprint. Many traditions in the Gospels originated in Aramaic, suggesting an extremely early date, maybe even predating Paul's letters in the 50s CE. We see this in a couple of ways. First, through direct Aramaic phrases that the Gospel writer Mark leaves untranslated before providing a translation for his Greek-speaking audience.
Like the famous moment when Jesus raises the girl from the dead?
Exactly. In Mark 5.41, Jesus says, "Talitha kumi," and Mark immediately translates it for the reader. "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The inclusion of the original Aramaic proves that Mark was relying on a tradition that had first circulated in Jesus' native tongue. It's direct linguistic evidence.
And the second type of linguistic evidence is even more subtle, right? Passages that are confusing in Greek but make perfect sense when you translate them back into Aramaic.
The classic scholarly example is the convoluted statement about the Sabbath in Mark 2. Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees, and he concludes, "Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." That conclusion is notoriously difficult in Greek.
It seems like a non sequitur.
It does, but scholars suggest this is a poor Greek translation of a simple Aramaic tradition where the term Son of Man simply meant a person or humanity. In Aramaic, the saying would have flowed perfectly. Therefore, a person is master even of the Sabbath. Only later, when it was translated into Greek, was Son of Man misinterpreted as a special title for Jesus.
That's fascinating. So the linguistic context reveals layers of interpretation and confirms the earliest kernel of the story was Aramaic. Let's look outside the canonical Gospels for a moment at early post-New Testament sources. Who is Papias?
Papias was a bishop writing his expositions of the sayings of the Lord around 121 to 30 CE. We only know of him through fragments quoted by later church fathers. But Papias explicitly said that he made every effort to seek out and recall accounts from companions of Jesus' disciples, whom he called the elders.
So he's tracing a direct chain of oral testimony.
A direct chain from the original apostles' generation down to his own time, independent of the finished Gospels we have today. It's a powerful validation that traditions about historical Jesus were highly valued and rigorously maintained.
We also have the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, written around 110 CE while he was being transported to Rome to be martyred. And he's not trying to prove Jesus outsiders, he's correcting internal theological problems.
Exactly. Ignatius was fighting against the rise of Docetism. Docetism is the belief some early Christians had that Christ's body was just an illusion, or that he only suffered in appearance.
Why would they believe that?
They just couldn't reconcile the idea of a divine, perfect being with messy, degrading human suffering.
So if Christians themselves are trying to spiritualize Jesus away, how did Ignatius push back?
He had to emphatically stress the physical, historical reality of Jesus. Ignatius repeatedly says that Jesus truly suffered, was truly born, both ate and drank, and was truly crucified under Pontius Pilate. His whole argument is that if Jesus only seemed to suffer, then we only seem to be saved. This is a crucial independent witness. It shows that the reality of Jesus' historical execution was so important that by 110 CE, it was being vigorously defended against internal skepticism. And this brings us to what are really the two historical pillars that, for virtually all critical scholars, provide overwhelming certainty for Jesus' existence and execution. The first is the personal knowledge of Paul, and the second is the theological implausibility of inventing a crucified Messiah.
Paul is our earliest surviving Christian author. He's writing his letters in the 50s CE, barely 20 years after Jesus' death. Mythicists often argue that Paul doesn't mention the historical Jesus. How does that argument crumble when we actually look at his letters?
It crumbles because Paul drops these undeniable biographical and familial details. He focuses on the theological meaning of the death and resurrection. Sure, not the narrative of the earthly ministry, but he certainly knew that ministry happened.
And the most significant piece of evidence is in Galatians.
Yes, in Galatians 1, Paul discusses his first trip to Jerusalem after his conversion. He mentions visiting Cephas, who is Peter, and then he specifically refers to James as the brother of the Lord.
So why do mythicists try to evade this by claiming brother of the Lord just means fellow believer?
That evasion is just contextually bankrupt. Paul clearly distinguishes James from Cephas, who was also a believer and an apostle. If brother of the Lord simply meant fellow believer, then Cephas would also have been a brother of the Lord. Paul uses this unique phrase for James precisely because he's differentiating them from all the other believers. The scholarly consensus is that Paul personally knew James, Jesus' actual biological brother.
For you, the listener, this is huge. If Jesus never existed, how could Paul, writing only 2 decades later, meet and discuss the movement with the man's own living brother? It's an enormous problem for the idea of a mythological invention.
It's a massive problem. And furthermore, Paul confirms Jesus' fundamental historical identity as a first-century Jew. In Romans 1.3, he confirms Jesus was a descendant of David according to the flesh, emphasizing his physical, human lineage. And he shows knowledge of Jesus' specific teachings.
Like on divorce.
Exactly. He knows the traditions around the Last Supper. He cites Jesus' teaching on divorce in 1 Corinthians 7, and his instruction that apostles have a right to financial support in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul clearly had access to the historical traditions, even if his letters focused on theology.
Okay, let's move to that second pillar, which Ehrman says is the single strongest historical argument. It has to do with the sheer theological implausibility of inventing a crucified Messiah.
This is the argument that passes the criterion of dissimilarity with flying colors. A tradition is likely historical if it conflicts with the known agendas and expectations of the early church or the context of first-century Judaism. And the crucifixion was the ultimate scandal, something no one would have made up.
So what exactly were the Jewish expectations of the Messiah in the first century?
They were overwhelmingly political and royal. Ancient Jews expected a powerful, King David-like figure, a military victor who would overthrow the forces of evil, which at the time meant the Roman Empire, and establish God's independent kingdom on earth. The Messiah was supposed to bring victory and glory.
And no Jewish text before Christianity anticipated a Messiah who would be killed.
Not just killed, but suffer and be defeated. It was the opposite of the expectation.
And the method of death crucifixion wasn't just defeat, it was a profound theological curse.
Yes. This is where scandal lies. Paul explicitly quotes Deuteronomy 21.23, which states that everyone who hangs on a tree is cursed. A person executed by crucifixion was understood to be under God's divine condemnation. For a messianic claimant to be executed this way was not just a political failure, it was irrefutable theological proof that he was a fraud, a false prophet cursed by God himself.
So if Jesus was just an invention created by people trying to start a new religion, they would have fabricated a glorious, powerful Messiah who defeated the Romans or was taken up into heaven.
Logically, yes. The natural response to your leader being crucified was for the followers to just disband immediately, out of shame and theological contradiction. The fact that the early followers didn't disband and instead founded a movement centered on this crucified figure requires a seismic historical explanation.
And what is that explanation?
The only viable historical explanation is that the crucifixion was an undeniable historical fact that the earliest followers could not erase. They were utterly convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, but they had to reconcile that conviction with the humiliating reality of his execution.
So they had a massive contradiction to solve.
A crushing contradiction. And it forced them to invent an entirely new theological concept, the suffering Messiah. They had to go back and radically reinterpret their own scriptures, like Isaiah 53, which previously were not understood messianically, to rationalize the historical fact. This profound intellectual and theological reversal only makes sense if the historical execution actually happened. So now that we've established the overwhelming probability of Jesus' existence, we can move to defining who he was and what he taught, using these same rigorous historical methods. And remember, historians never claim absolute certainty, only high probability.
Let's review those methods as we apply them to Jesus' ministry. We've mentioned contextual credibility and multiple attestation. How about the criterion of dissimilarity applied to one of his actions, not just the crucifixion?
The criterion is most powerful when a tradition contradicts what the church later believed. So consider the claim that Jesus was baptized for the forgiveness of sins by John the Baptist.
Which is awkward for later theology.
It's very awkward. In the later church, Jesus was divine and sinless, and John was his inferior. The early church would never invent a story showing their divine Lord submitting to a ritual for sinners by a figure who was, at that point, presumptively superior to him. Because that tradition is so awkward, so contradictory to later church theology, historians consider it highly probable that it actually happened.
Okay, so applying these methods, critical scholars have reached a majority consensus on Jesus' core identity, and it's one that's often challenging for modern readers. He was a Jewish apocalypticist. Can you define that term for us?
An apocalypticist is an individual who believes that the world is currently controlled by powerful evil forces, but that God is about to intervene catastrophically, an event we call the apocalypse. This intervention will destroy the forces of evil, crush the rulers of the earth like Rome, and usher in a utopian kingdom of God here on earth.
And this was a common belief at the time.
Very prevalent among groups like the Pharisees in these scenes. But for Jesus, this wasn't some distant future. It was imminent.
What's the primary evidence that confirms this original apocalyptic core of Jesus' message?
First, his direct link to John the Baptist. John was an established apocalyptic prophet who preached that judgment was coming now, that the axe was laid to the root of the tree. Jesus' association with John, including his baptism by him, ties him directly to this apocalyptic movement.
And second,
and most powerfully, his prediction that the world would end within this generation. This is multiply attested in the earliest sources, like Mark 13:30, where Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened."
that prediction that the world would end within the lifetime of his audience is obviously problematic because, well, the world didn't end. How did that failure impact the message?
It forced the later church to engage in what we call de-apocalypticization. They had to soften or change the message. For example, in the earliest sources, like Q, Jesus preached about the imminent arrival of the Son of Man, a future cosmic judge who would establish the kingdom.
But that's not what you see in the later gospel.
Exactly. In the later Gospel of John, written at the turn of the century, Jesus no longer preaches about a future kingdom. Instead, he says things like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And the focus shifts to eternal life as a present spiritual reality, not a future cataclysmic event.
This shift from a future cataclysmic event to present wisdom is the strongest proof that the primitive core of the teaching must have been that literal, failed apocalyptic prediction.
Absolutely. They wouldn't have needed to edit the message unless the original inconvenient message had failed to materialize. The need for editing confirms the original content.
Okay, so based on this apocalyptic worldview, what specific actions define Jesus' public ministry?
Well, his mission was really twofold. First, ethical preparation for the kingdom. He emphasized the core of the Torah-loving God and loving your neighbor over the meticulous interpretations of the oral law championed by groups like the Pharisees, especially the strict rules about the Sabbath and ritual purity.
And second was his controversial social outreach.
Yes. He gained a reputation for associating with social outcasts, tax collectors and sinners. And this wasn't just simple compassion, it was theology in action. It supported his apocalyptic reversal theology. In the coming kingdom, the last would be first, and those rejected by society now would be exalted later.
And that tradition is well attested.
Multiply attested in Mark, Q, M, and L, and it's highly unlikely to be invented by a later, more organized church that generally valued piety and order.
His ministry culminates in Jerusalem, and his single most significant historical action seems to be his opposition to the temple itself, which led directly to his arrest.
The temple was the center of all political, economic, and religious power in Jerusalem. It was run by the wealthy aristocratic priests known as the Sadducees. The tradition that Jesus predicted the temple would be destroyed is multiply attested. So when Jesus entered the temple precincts and caused a physical disturbance, flipping tables, maybe stopping the sacrifice system, it was an open, seditious challenge to the Sadducees and their very carefully maintained relationship with Rome.
The Sadducees, focused on keeping the peace during the volatile Passover festival, saw him not as a theological threat, but as a political one, a threat to their survival.
Precisely. So they engineered his arrest. But the Sadducees didn't execute anyone. Rome did. They handed him over to Pilate with the charge of sedition, claiming he was proclaiming himself the King of the Jews, the Messiah. This is why the sign placed over the cross was Ini Narai, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Idiorum. The execution was Roman, based on the political charge that he was a messianic pretender who might spark an uprising.
Finally, we should briefly address the common mythicist claim that the town of Nazareth didn't even exist in Jesus' day.
Right. This claim is based on its absence from the Hebrew Bible and some early archaeological difficulties. However, modern archaeological evidence has confirmed that Nazareth did exist as a small, extremely poor, insignificant Jewish hamlet during Jesus' lifetime. It was simply too poor and too small for Josephus or any elite writer to ever mention.
And the existence of this tradition is powerful historical evidence in itself.
It passes the criterion of dissimilarity beautifully. No Christian would ever invent a Messiah coming from a despised, poor, unknown village like Nazareth. This fact was historically inconvenient, which is exactly why later gospel authors like Matthew and Luke had to invent stories to relocate his birth to the prestigious prophetic city of Bethlehem to try and reconcile the historical reality of his origins with Jewish messianic prophecy. The historical reality is that Jesus was a Nazarene.
So let's summarize what we have established here. The historical case for Jesus' existence is not based on blind faith, but on a rigorous analysis of independent first-century sources.
We have seen abundant and varied evidence. We have Paul's letters, the earliest surviving Christian documents, which attest to Jesus' physical birth, his family, and specific teachings.
We have independent confirmation of his execution from non-Christian historians like Tacitus and the pared-down Josephus.
And we have multiple independent written source streams, Mark, Q, M, L, John N, all pointing back to a single man who lived, taught, and died in first-century Palestine.
And those two pillars of certainty are incredibly robust. Paul's personal meeting with Jesus' brother James, and the profound theological scandal of the crucified Messiah, which only makes sense that the execution was an undeniable historical fact that early followers had to overcome.
The argument that Jesus was a mythological invention is, at the end of the day, intellectually weak. It relies heavily on misinformation, on sensation, and on the arbitrary dismissal of vast amounts of inconvenient evidence. The problem with Jesus for the modern world is not that he didn't exist, but that he was too historical. He was an ineluctably Jewish, first-century apocalyptic prophet, entirely rooted in his own time, who was, it seems, fundamentally mistaken about the imminent end of the world. Understanding him means stripping away 2,000 years of later interpretation and facing that demanding original figure.
We thank you again for listening to the mini-book podcast, Proof of Christ Edition. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe and tell others about this podcast. We also encourage you to suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear discussed in future episodes. Thank you for subscribing and listening. 5 seconds of silence.